Hey everyone, welcome to the Anexinet, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 31, recorded April 19th, 2018. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Director of Cloud Solutions at Anexinet. Here on the Anexinet, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we are going to discuss Docker, DevOps, and possibly other things that start with D, with a fellow Cloud Field Day delegate, Mr. Nick Janetakis. I hope I got that close to right. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ned. Yeah, that was pretty close.
Pretty
Janetakis.
close? Janetakis? Okay. And
I heard a little O in there, but it's okay.
I assume that's Greek? Would that be correct?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I've been to a big fat Greek wedding. My wife's, one of her friends from college is Greek, and she married a Greek boy, and so they had a big old Greek wedding in Jamaica, Queens area.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was
Or
awesome.
I should say my apologies.
No, it was great. We had a fantastic time. We got to get away from the kids for a couple days, so that's always a nice break, though it's fun to go back to them as well.
Definitely.
So first and foremost, Nick, why don't you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and how you got into the crazy world of IT and development?
Okay. I've been a web developer now for about 20 years. And for me, I kind of started pretty late. I was about 16, 17 years old. And
wow,
that puts a little bit of it dates me a little bit, but
I don't think of 16 or 17 as very late in the process to start a career. That's I would call a little early. But
right.
That's awesome. So you started 16 and 17. What were you doing at that point?
At that point, I was going to 2,600 meetups in New York City and messing around on AOL. What really got me into programming was, surprisingly, Visual Basic 6. So I used to go to these 2,600 meetings and was on AOL, and there were, these weird like AOL bots and things like that. And I'm like, how do I make one of those? And then I just randomly heard about Visual Basic 6. And at that point, there was no Google back then. Mm-hmm. So you just had to try things out. So I just downloaded Visual Basic 6, went through the documentation, and kind of just filled my way through the application itself until I got to the point where I was able to actually develop something.
Okay. What sort of IDE was pasted onto VB6 back then?
It was just the one provided by Microsoft. It was, I guess, Visual Basic 6 IDE. I forgot the exact name.
So I guess it was probably like pre-Visual Studio.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it was pre.NET, but I think it may have been called Visual Studio back then. I'm not too sure. Okay.
And so you built something on VB6. Was it a bot?
It was a bot. Yeah, I was one of those script kiddie jerks, teenage year stuff.
Okay. So it would interact with other people on chat and maybe play some pranks on them or something?
Played some pranks on them, and people who downloaded my bot to try it out, it would play Slayer music and things like that. It was just one of those weird, crazy bot programs.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that chatbots were a thing way back then. So it's interesting that we're still talking about bots today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So you started out with that, but where did things progress from there?
From there, it progressed to web development. So back then, I don't know how many of your listeners will remember GeoCities, but back then, that was the place to go to put up your webpage. This is pre-MySpace type of stuff.
Right.
And, I just threw out my own HTML page there, and it was very basic, and it had Comic Sans text, and it played the Exorcist theme song in MIDI, and it had my programs and all about the metal bands that I liked. It was pretty horrific.
Well, you are in good company when it comes to GeoCity sites because if I remember correctly, they were all pretty hideous in their own unique ways.
Oh, yeah. You had the blinking text. I remember there was one funny animated GIF of this one guy peeing on an Internet Explorer 3 button or something like that. That was an HR ruler that spanned the actual site horizontally.
Okay. Yeah, sort of the internet equivalent of Calvin peeing on the Ford logo or something. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I remember GeoCities. I'm pretty sure that's all shut down. Somebody bought GeoCities. I can't remember. Maybe it was Yahoo bought them, and now Yahoo is owned by Oath, which is owned by Verizon. It's a tangled web we weave.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I actually forgot the username that I had on GeoCities, but one of those companies who did buy it out, they have like an archive up where if you happen to know your username, you can see what it was back then.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I definitely had one of my bands had a site on GeoCities, and it was awful. I mean, definitely horrendous. Definitely had a visitor counter because everybody needed one of those, and blinking text, and I'm sure many of the other UI sins that everybody propagated on GeoCities. So you did GeoCities. I'm assuming you moved on from that to some more dynamic and interesting web development. So where did things progress from there?
So from there, I was really big into playing a video game called Quake. And at that time, I believe it was Quake 2. And, I got pretty competitive with it. So I joined a clan, which is like a group of people, a couple of buddies, and we would play together competitively. And we had this idea where one of them was like, hey, we should build a gaming ladder together. And then this way, the whole community would have a place to, compete with each other, where it would be ranked on a ladder, and it would be pretty cool because nothing really existed back then that did that. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was one site, but it was like really, really awful. We were like, you know what? We can do it better. So my buddy, he started coding that up with ASP Classic. Like this must have been early 2000s, I guess.
Sure.
And, he was really responsible for coding the back end. So all the ASP Classic code he wrote, but I did the design portion of it. And that was kind of my taste into like, real world web development. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty interesting. I mean, we grew that pretty well for just two high school kids who had no idea how to do anything.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
In a way, it was like my first taste of building a SaaS business, but without getting paid, sort of.
Well, most SaaS businesses aren't profitable for the first 5 years anyway.
Yeah. I think that's about how long we ran it too, about 4 or 5 years.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that was an ongoing thing for a long time. Did you reconfigure the site over time to take advantage of new technologies, or did you kind of put it on the back burner on life support and move on to bigger and better projects?
We kept it going on ASP Classic. I mean, it had some grand rewrites once or twice, but it never moved on to better tech. But surprisingly, it actually performed pretty well. I mean, we had 14,000 people on there and hundreds of teams. It actually ran pretty good.
Ah, that's awesome.
We kind of lucked out because one of our clanmates, he actually owned a web hosting company, so he gave us a nice juicy box just for the platform.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, if no one's paying you for it, then you still have to pay your hosting fees. But I guess in that case, it was prorated or at cost or something like that.
Yep.
All right, so you built a web platform, thousands of people using it, and then you moved on to something else, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I was hooked on the whole web development stuff. I'm like, whoa, you know what? This is something I really, really, really want to do. And I learned from really early on that I just can't work like a regular job. I tried the whole being a busboy and, working at a trophy shop, assembling trophies when I was 18 or whatever. Uh-huh. And that whole get up, go to work, maybe do this for the next 40 years, retire, and then live the good life. It doesn't connect with me at all. I have no problem with people who like that, but yeah, it just wasn't for me. So I kind of got hooked on freelance work almost immediately. And it's kind of weird because, gaming really helped me there because there were a lot of people who knew me and my friend and, the platform that we built together. So they were like, hey, Nick, can you help me build my Quake clan page? Or, hey, Nick, we're building this new ladder. Can you help us design it and do things like that? So a lot of work that I did back then were just helping people figure out, how to build their own sites. So that was my first taste of freelance work where, most of the time it wasn't paid, but sometimes it was paid.
Okay.
And then from there, I kind of just built up a portfolio and I eventually launched my own web design firm, which is kind of hilarious because it was just me, but I kind of wrote the site in such a way where it looked like, oh, I was a big shot and I had some employees and things like that. It's kind of dumb, right? When you're a kid, you kind of think those things are important when they're actually not. But it worked. I mean, people hired me from just that portfolio page, but mostly I did a lot of local work for businesses around the neighborhood.
Okay. So it's interesting how some people think that they need to put out a presence that is larger than themselves. So you said like, oh, I'm a web design firm and I'll write the text and the content of the front-facing site with a lot of we and us. So it seems like we're a team when it's really just me. Where I've seen other freelancers have really just, they speak in the first person and I will do this. And I've seen both approaches work. It's interesting. I'm not sure which approach resonates more with certain types of clients. Have you seen any difference in how clients react to whether it's just you or if they perceive there's a whole team?
I haven't noticed too much of a difference, but nowadays for sure, I don't try to play it off that I'm like some big firm. It's just me. Like I'm the guy doing the work, setting things up. I think it works out better if you just, tell the truth, what you're actually doing.
Yeah, and I think freelance in general has gotten a lot more popular over the last 5 years or so. There's whole sites dedicated to just people promoting their freelance work. And so it's not surprising to anybody anymore that you're a freelancer working independently, as opposed to, maybe in the past people really only felt comfortable working with big firms. Though I've found that really big firms have a lot of red tape and roadblocks in the way and don't work in a particularly agile fashion. So if you're trying to get something put together quickly, then a freelancer, an independent, or just a small team is probably the way to go.
Oh, definitely. I agree too. Because a lot of those times, with the bigger firms, the guy you're speaking with or girl, whatever, the client that you're speaking with isn't the person developing the site or application. It may end up going through 3 people before the coder gets to even hear about the project.
Oh, that reminds me of Office Space, where they were talking to the guy. He's like, what do? I take the specs from the engineers and give them to the customers. Well, couldn't the engineers just give them to the customers? No. I'm a people person, damn it. That level of abstraction is definitely there with the larger firms where the person you're talking to is not the person who's actually doing the work, and there could be like 3 layers of intermediation there. That's not a good way to get things done quickly.
Nope, or accurately based on what the client wants.
That's true. Something gets lost in translation. It's like, was that Telegraph or Whisper Down the Lane?
Yep.
So
that old phone game.
So speaking of doing things agile and quickly, I come from an ops side. You're more on the development side, and it sounds like if you mush those together, we meet somewhere in the DevOps world. So what would you say your perspective is on DevOps? Is it something you embrace, you practice, you don't care for, you hate the term?
Well, that is one of those funny terms, right? Where if you asked about 100 different people to define what DevOps is, you're going to get 100 different answers. And for me, like someone who's always either a solo developer or kind of working with small teams, because some of my freelance work and it involves being employed by smaller teams, I just see it as like, you take responsibility for not only developing your code, but also making sure that it runs well in production.
So it's taking that responsibility from not just throwing the code over the wall, but actually being responsible for the fact that it's going to be deployed somewhere, and if something breaks, you're kind of on the hook for it.
Right. Because I'm always reminded by that one picture of that little innocent girl like standing in front of that burning like house, and then it's like ops problem now, like that meme picture.
Yeah, I've seen that meme picture. We should throw a link in the show notes for anybody who hasn't. But yeah, I've seen that meme used a couple times, and as a former, not former, but as an ops person, the on-call thing is very real. And when you do get that call at 2 a.m. on a Saturday because something went sideways and it turned out to be an application error, rousing the development team could be challenging at best. But if they're on that page line as well, now they've got some real skin in the game when it comes to the operations of code versus just the creation of it.
Oh, yeah. Because from my point of view, when I say, the developer should be responsible for both developing and getting it running in production, like I don't mean that would eliminate someone who has an ops job already. Like instead of being 2 totally isolated different teams, like in a bigger organization, maybe those 2 people would be together as the same team. Everybody kind of gets together and, the ops guy won't be developing features on the application, but he may understand the components of what the application uses and will know how to, scale them and use them properly.
Right, and he can sort of share his knowledge of the ops side with the developer and say, hey, you might not want to do it this way because when we operationalize it and roll it into production, it's not going to work the way you intended.
Exactly, because if you're just that developer who has no apps experience at all, you're kind of in your own little world. Like you may have a powerful MacBook Pro or like a Surface, like whatever computer you have. It may have, 8 CPU cores, 16 gigs of RAM, like a really nice SSD, and you have no data at all in like your development database. And it's like, whoops, you just made an N+1 query that executed 800 queries, and you never even think about like how that's going to run in production.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's the classic, well, it worked on my laptop problem.
Yep. That's really funny. Like, oh, it worked on my machine. That's the classic one.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the ways that I feel like we've tried to get away from that is by embracing newer technologies like containers, especially with Docker. And I noticed that you are a Docker captain. So how did you get that designation, and what have you been doing in the container space?
Okay, so a Docker captain is a title that Docker gives out to certain community members. It's not like an official employee type of thing, like Docker doesn't pay me for this. But one or two engineers at Docker, I want to say maybe early 2016, I guess they vouched for me because at that point I was just writing some blog posts about Docker and I had just released my first Docker course. And they kind of just liked the work that I was doing, so they invited me to be a Docker captain.
Okay, so you were already doing work with Docker and blogging about it, sort of raising the community awareness of how to use it and what it was. And Docker was like, thank you for doing that. Let's give you this designation.
Yeah, and even today, I think we have about 55 or 60 captains. It's something where, you can't just ask Docker to become a Docker captain. If you're out there, putting out good content, helping people, like you'll get noticed. Like maybe you won't get picked, but maybe you will be. It's one of those things.
Okay. And so are there particular benefits around becoming a Docker captain? I mean, aside from just the recognition?
Oh yeah, we have a private Slack channel where we kind of just all group together. So from the networking point of view, if you ever get stuck or maybe you have some extra freelance work to give to somebody else, we kind of just all work together to help each other out.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
There's some other little perks too, like when it comes to going to DockerCon, which I'm pretty sure I will be going to June 12th, I think it is, of this year. But like, Docker captains get a free ride there. Like we need to pay our way to get there, but the ticket itself is free.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay, that's very cool. And so are you speaking at DockerCon or are you just attending?
This time just attending. Speaking in the future is something I want to get better at. So I haven't done any large-scale talks yet, and trying to do that maybe at DockerCon for the first time would be a little bit rough.
Do they have something along the lines of like lightning talks or like sort of sidebar talks? See, I know some of the conferences I've gone to, they have the big, conference hall talks, but then they also have like small projection screens set up in like random corners and stuff where people are doing more like 20-minute quick talks about something.
Right. I've actually never been to a previous DockerCon, so I can't answer that, but they might. I know there's workshops as well. So that's one thing as being a Docker captain is, we're asked to volunteer to help people out in those workshops. If people ask questions, maybe we just go around the room and get people going, that type of stuff.
Okay. So you said you did some blog posts and a training. So you're also developing training for Docker and other things. How did you get into the educational training space of things?
That one was kind of weird. So I've been doing freelance dev work for a while, and along the road I've learned about a whole bunch of different technologies, Ruby on Rails, Flask, typical web stack stuff, Postgres, Redis, Elasticsearch, etc. And when I did some work for quite a few different clients, I kept finding patterns. Like they kept asking me, hey, can you develop this type of app? Hey, can you develop this type of app? And before you know it, as a developer, like, the light starts blinking in your head and you're like, well, maybe I can just like automate myself out of that job by making a course about that.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. Okay. Yeah, I've heard that before, automating myself out of a job. I think, isn't that on your like LinkedIn profile or something?
I don't know. It might be.
But yeah, I really like that sort of mentality of, going into a new job, learning a task, automating that task, and now you've kind of automated yourself out of that job, but you've learned and you've increased your skill level, and you won't get bored doing the same repetitive task over and over.
Right.
Yeah,
it's kind of.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it's kind of interesting how the two play together, like doing the freelance work and being the course creator. They kind of feed each other in two different ways. Like when it comes to thinking about, what should I make a course on? A lot of times those topics come straight from freelance work. But then it's pretty cool too, because people who take my course, they, if they like the course, they may want to work with me one-on-one. So then they hire me to do some freelance work for them, like on an individual scale.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't think so. That's some good follow-on from, you've credentialized yourself with the training course, and now you've got some follow-on work that pays the bills.
Yep.
Okay. And so far, how many courses have you put together, and what are the topics?
The very first course I did was building a SaaS app with Flask.
Okay.
And I actually built a couple of different SaaS apps for a couple different people, and that's how that course came to existence. And it basically takes you from, let's assume that you already know a bit about Python, but you're not so much into web development yet with Flask. It just takes you from ground zero at Flask to actually building a production-ready, like 4,000-line application, but we build it up in stages. So it starts off from like a single, app.py file, and then it just grows to the full-blown app in the end over time.
Okay. All right, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so Flask, if I'm remembering correctly, that's a framework based on, is that Python?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And it's using Python to build sites, basically.
Yeah, if you're coming from like the Node world, it's sort of similar to Express, or in Ruby land, it's a little bit like Sinatra.
Okay, I don't know Sinatra. Names for languages and projects and frameworks are always interesting. I know there's one out there called Celery. I feel like there's another one called Tomato. It's like you can build a whole salad out of frameworks.
So what's really funny about that one? It's actually real funny that you brought it up. I use Celery because it's a very popular like background worker for Python. So I've written a blog post where I use Celery and kind of talk about it. And this one marketing company just cold emailed me, and they were like, "Hey, we want to make a guest post on your blog." And it was like, 5 tips on like how to blend celery, like the actual food.
They might want to tweak their marketing algorithm a little bit. Maybe you can help them with that. So getting back to the topic of containers, because I find them really interesting from an intellectual standpoint, but I'm curious, like what aspects of containers do you find most intriguing, and how do you use them in like real life operations?
So for me, like what we talked about before, like the it works for me problems, like those just kind of go away with containers. And I feel like there's real world benefits of that big time, especially like imagine it doesn't even matter if you're a freelancer or not, but let's say that you get hired at a new job and they're like, well, okay, it's time to get our application set up on your laptop or whatever computer. That's a big deal if you don't have your app containerized in some cases. It may involve going through like a 5,000 word markdown document that hasn't been touched since like 1987. And like you're responsible for setting up that whole app yourself. Just, grudging through it line by line, hoping that these commands work. It's that's a pretty big burden to have. And then it's like you finally get it up and running. Maybe there were some problems along the way. And like the next thing you know, you started Monday, but it's like Thursday and the app still isn't working.
Right. And you haven't done any actual work for the client that hired you.
Right.
Yeah. So I imagine containers would solve that, because you could put that application in a container and then all you have to do is just spin it up using Docker run, and you're off to the races within a couple minutes instead of 3 days.
Right. The hard part at that point, and it's not even hard, it's just like getting Docker installed, getting Docker Compose installed, or whatever tools that you use. And then it's like, you run that one command, wait a little bit until it builds, and you're on, you're good to go. Wow. And it's interesting too, right? From the developer's point of view, who also wants to get maybe into the app stuff. If you're talking about also deploying your application, you might be running Windows or Mac OS on your dev box, but when it comes to deploying your application, if it's not containerized, then you need to understand how to deploy that on a Linux system, because you're probably going to use Ubuntu or CentOS, like whatever you happen to use. But now suddenly it's like you're starting from ground zero. How do I use like apt or another package manager, and how do I configure this thing on Linux? Like you're just getting different versions of what you have on your own dev box.
Right. Yeah. So the thing that I think of most often is I see a lot of developers using a Mac, and then the actual hosts that are going to run that in production aren't running Mac OS, obviously. They're probably running some flavor of Linux. So having that sort of consistency, it's just a container, so the underlying layers are abstracted away, seems like it would be very useful.
Yep. And there's also other like additional benefits as well, just from the development side of view. So I don't know how much experience you have working with dynamic languages like Python or Ruby, but when it comes down to it, let's use Ruby for an example. Like right now, Ruby 2.5 is the latest version, but in a couple of months or next year or whatever, it's going to be Ruby 2.6. And what happens when you need to have Ruby 2.5 and Ruby 2.6 on your box at the same time? Well, now you need to start using these third-party tools that kind of like, well, you'll install both of them on your box, but then you need to switch the current one to be active based on what application you're building. Like it just becomes a nightmare of just dependencies all over the place not being the same.
Right.
So Docker really helps there. And it goes beyond just the runtime of the programming language as well. Like if you're running Postgres, 9.6 from a project of last year, but now you just want to use Postgres 10, it's like, well, are you going to install two different versions of Postgres and then try to figure out how to run both on your dev box just to work on both projects? Like it gets really weird.
Yeah, that reminds me of some of the things that HashiCorp was trying to address when they created Vagrant, which is sort of like, I need this development environment with these very specific versions of the application and database, so I'm going to use a virtual machine via Vagrant and VirtualBox to spin up that environment quickly and then throw it away when I don't need it. But I know that in that case, you're spinning up a whole virtual machine and you need VirtualBox, but I think Docker's much faster and a little more performant in that regard, right?
Yeah, so if you do the Vagrant setup, which is something I used to do back in the day, you're looking at probably like 800 megs per project that you work on because that's what the VM takes up. But more importantly, like the downside to it is just the performance. Like if you're mounting in your code over a VirtualBox shared folder, it's kind of crappy. And there's all weird like edge cases that come up. Like I've had asset files get corrupted and like your web server needs to turn on like or turn off flags like send file. Like it gets really weird and broken.
Okay. So Docker's a slightly better experience.
Yeah, especially if you happen to run Docker for Windows or I suppose Docker for Mac. I don't have much experience with that though.
Yeah, Docker for Windows is getting better every day. That's what I was saying.
So like my dev setup, I run Windows 10 Pro and I just run Docker for Windows. And then I also use Windows Subsystem for Linux. And I have Docker configured to where I can interact with the Docker for Windows host from WSL. And things work really well. Like I have large Rails apps with like, 10,000 lines of code. And the performance is really, really good with Docker. I'll go in and make a code change to the app. And the app code is being volume mounted into Docker in real time. And after I make that code change, Rails will pick it up in about 100 milliseconds. So it's actually faster than I can even react to going to my browser and clicking reload.
Wow. Okay. That seems very useful. So I know Windows 10, they're making some updates around how Docker for Windows works. So are you on the stable channel or are you on the edge channel for that?
I just run the edge channel in development.
Okay. Yeah, because I know they were doing some things around more natively running Linux, I guess leveraging WSL, rather than creating that Moby VM that runs on Hyper-V and then spinning up the containers in that. So is that what you're doing?
No, I still use the Moby one, but I think I know what you're talking about, like the LCOW or whatever it is. I don't know the actual details.
Linux container on Windows, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's still very unstable and a little unpredictable when I tried it, so you might want to wait.
Yeah.
But, okay. Now, we talked about all the cool things about containers. I'm curious, since you work with them, what aspects of containers have you found most frustrating?
Well, that's kind of funny because as someone who's a course instructor, I get a lot of feedback from different students about their problems with getting set up with Docker. And it seems like for a lot of people on Mac, that volume mount performance is not the best. Like, it's actually pretty slow. And, Docker's aware of this. And even with a large sample size on my end, like, I just can't figure out what combination of, hardware and macOS versions and this and that versions are causing the problems. But, it's really painful when a student is like, well, everything is up and running and it's cool, but it takes like 11 seconds for the code to reload when it should take like half a second.
Right. And that's just because the volume's sitting on the Mac OS and it has to mount it into the container and something is slowing it down?
Correct. Like, this would be a development problem that just because in production you wouldn't have that volume, plus you'd be running Linux natively. But yeah, I mean, I guess getting up and running in development for some OS versions could be a little bit painful. Also, it really depends on what stack you have as well. I've heard a lot of people say, maybe Rails works okay, but like Laravel or some other web frameworks, they happen to run a little bit slower through Docker.
Okay. So one of the things that I get asked about a lot is cloud native type applications. And oftentimes that is assumed that you're using containers in some way. So I'm curious, when you hear people talk about cloud native, do you think that necessitates containers, or is that part of a bigger story?
I think that's probably part of a bigger story, because you could still be cloud native without using containers, right? Like the good old days where you just spin up an EC2 instance, drop in your code using like Chef or Ansible or whatever you happen to use. Mm-hmm. So containers are kind of just the next level, I guess you can say. And I don't even mean that as like the next level you should take, but it's like the next level you could go to if you want to.
Okay. And do you think there's a level beyond containers? I might be hinting about something called serverless.
Yeah, definitely. But I'm really not that knowledgeable with serverless, because it kind of just feels like we're in the serverless wild, wild west now, where like every cloud provider has their own implementation of it. And there's other frameworks that are out there. They're like, what is that one called? Apex, I think. The AWS one. But in either case, yeah, there's a lot of different companies doing a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, AWS has Lambda for serverless. And then Azure, because they're real creative, called it Azure Functions. And then I think Google has something as well. And then IBM has like OpenWhisk. And then there's another project to bring it on-prem called like OpenFaz. So yeah, like I said, it's very much the wild, wild west of serverless. And do you differentiate between serverless and functions as a service?
I think ultimately they're basically the same thing, but that's like coming from my, I really have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to that topic. But I mean, yeah, they're essentially the same category, right? It's like the whole idea of not having any servers that you manage, but you just reach out and use these third-party services that are provided by the cloud providers.
Right. Do you think that we have to reach some sort of kind of standard in the same way that containers had to reach a standard before you'll see, widespread adoption?
Oh, yeah, totally. And don't get me wrong here, too. Like, yeah, okay, I have some Docker courses out there, but I'm very, very pragmatic when it comes to things like this. Like, the only reason I moved to Docker was because doing it without Docker really sucked. So in the future, if the serverless stuff gets, abstracted away and, things get created to where you're not really stuck with vendor lock-in everywhere, then I can totally, I'll just jump ship and use it if it makes my life better as a developer. If it means that I don't need to manage servers and I can kind of develop my apps maybe a little bit differently to what I'm used to, but not totally crazy different, yeah, I would jump ship totally, 100%.
So you're not married to the technology. It's just whatever technology enables you to achieve a goal, right?
Yeah. And that's kind of how I started too, right? Like when it came to programming, I find that a lot of developers, they're like, well, should I learn Ruby on Rails? Should I learn Flask or Node or whatever? I think if they just sit there and have something like a goal to move towards and you just get started and start writing code, that's the way to go for sure.
Okay. So don't try to learn a particular language at an abstract level. Instead, start with, I want to develop this thing, and then pick a language and go.
Right. And the same thing applies here with serverless or containers or whatever you want to set up. Don't just learn it for the sake of learning it. If it really gives you a big benefit in the end and it helps you move towards your goal, then yeah, definitely go, try it out. But don't just try to spend your time learning for the sake of it.
Right. Whatever the hot new language is, it shouldn't just run out and learn it to learn it.
Yeah, because that's never going to end, right? The new hotness is always like 1 month away.
That's true. And that sort of harkens back to where we started with the conversation and your first thing, which was writing something in VB6 to create AOL chatbots. And really, that was very pragmatic. You wanted to build a chatbot. Oh, here's VB6. They'll let me do it. Let me learn that so I can achieve this goal.
Yep.
Hey, I tied it all back. That was good. So one other thing that I noticed is when we were at Cloud Field Day, you were using a Chromebook for the entire duration, which I was impressed by. There were some people that were just strictly iPad Pro, some people with traditional Mac and Windows, and then you were like the lone Chromebook guy. So why just the Chromebook? And were you running straight Chrome OS on that, or is it sort of a custom build?
Okay, so at home, I work off of like a desktop workstation. So I have a tower and all the parts are spec'd out. I don't have a portable computing device. So about 2 years ago, I'm like, you know what? I need some type of laptop because I'm going to meetups and doing this and that, going to start traveling a bit. And I kind of just went down this huge rabbit hole of researching laptops. And, you know, I didn't want to just go and spend $2,500 on like a brand new Surface or MacBook Pro or whatever.
Right.
So, and it's not even just the money. I'm like, well, let me try out a laptop and see what happens. And I ended up finding Chromebooks had, well, a specific Chromebook, that Toshiba 2015 one. It has really good specs. Like it's 1080p. It's an IPS monitor. It weighs less than 3 pounds. You know, it has 4 gigs of RAM, and you can put in an SSD size of whatever you want pretty easily. You just pop off a couple screws in the back. And then I figured out there's this operating system called Gallium OS. And it's like a fork off of Xubuntu, and it's really just hyper optimized to work with Chromebooks. So I may have been running a Chromebook, but I'm running Gallium OS, which is essentially native Linux, and it's a full-blown laptop at this point. Like I run Dockerized apps on it, listen to music, you know, YouTube streams going on. Like it's a full development environment with no problem.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I have a Chromebook at home as well, and it's an Acer, but I got a Toshiba for one of my in-laws because I was tired of fixing her computer, and that thing screams. She's had it for probably about 2 years now, and it still is just awesome. And I was surprised at the level of hardware that you can get for relatively little money. I think that thing was like $250 or something.
Yeah.
So you don't have to pay $2,500 to get a good laptop.
Now, I'm thinking in terms of CPU, it's like one notch below an i3, but most of the languages that I work with are not compiled, so the CPU just isn't getting wrecked, you know? So it works out pretty nicely.
Right, yeah. I would have to say for the majority of what I do, it's not CPU intensive. It's mostly, you know, browsing and remoting into other things to do work, or, you know, running PowerShell or something. So generally speaking, the CPU is just kind of ticking along at 5 or 6%.
Yep.
All right. Well, I think we're coming up around time. Last question I wanted to ask you, I like to ask this for everyone, is what is your favorite 80s movie?
Wow. You really dropped it on me here. Favorite 80s movie? I really like the movie Airplane. I'm big into comedies.
Airplane, that's a great one. The first one or the sequel?
Oh, the first one.
Yeah. The second one, just too many repeats of the same gag, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good movies, though. There's Goonies. Yeah. It's a hard list to come up with, just to narrow it down to one. It
is, but I like to go with the first instinct. So Airplane sounds good. I haven't actually gotten that one before, so that's one for the books. Awesome.
Nice.
All right. If people want to know more about you, take your courses, follow you on Twitter, where do you tweet, where do you blog, those types of things?
My website is nickjanetakis.com. And
spelled
then
like it
on
sounds.
Twitter, yeah, you guys got it, no problem. I imagine that'll be in the show notes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then on Twitter, I'm just at Nick Janetakis. If you want to learn about Docker specifically, my courses site there is diveintodocker.com.
All right, I'm surprised that wasn't already taken. That's a good one. Dive into Docker.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Nick, for being on the show.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And that was our show with Nick Janetakis. Thanks to the marketing team for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Anexinet for helping produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital transformation, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet to see how they can help. If you've enjoyed this episode of Anexipod, why not leave us a nice review on iTunes? If you're looking for more content, you can check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow. On the show, I am joined weekly by my co-host, Chris Hayner, to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. You can find out more about me and what I am up to on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it.